Hi guys, this is Todd with Real Active Wellness. Thanks for joining me again today. I'm going to talk about a hip flexor stretch today, and I have scoured the internet to find a good video, even a picture on a good quality hip flexor stretch. And the reason is that oftentimes I will prescribe or recommend a good hip flexor stretch to a client for a number of reasons. And I struggle to find anything good online for it. And I don't know why, because it's one of those muscles that is chronically tight worldwide, but certainly in our country because we sit so often. And it is a major contributor, if not the most important contributor, to low back pain, low back discomfort. We hear all the time that somebody threw out their back, whatever that means. And usually what happens is some of the hip flexors will go into a really aggressive muscle spasm. So for that reason, among many others, learning how to stretch the hip flexors is a really important part of anyone's health and fitness. Also, just to try to mitigate some of our postural distortions in this country, again, because we sit so frequently. So let's get into it. Most people will show a hip flexor stretch that looks like this. Get down on a knee and really just lean forward. I'm going to suggest that that's not really a great hip flexor stretch. We need to understand a little bit more about it, and let's tweak that. We'll refine that system or that pattern so that we can get a more effective hip flexor stretch. First things first, stretching in general means this. Whatever the muscle does, we're going to undo that. So if the muscle flexes the elbow, we're going to try to extend the elbow to get a stretch. If it raises the arm, we're going to try to extend the arm to get a stretch. So first thing we need to do is understand what do the hip flexors do, and then we're going to know what to undo so that we can get into an effective stretch. So let's take a look at this reference that I drew up for you. One of the primary hip flexors is a muscle called the psoas, and it actually has two different divisions. One of them is called the iliacus, and one of them is the psoas, and if we put the two of them together, it's called the iliopsoas complex. This is the only muscle that connects the spine and the leg directly. All other muscles go from spine to pelvis and then pelvis to leg. So it's very unique in the sense that it has a tremendous amount of influence on the spine because it is a major controller of the leg. So because it attaches to the spine and because it attaches to the leg, that means it's going to influence both the spine and the leg at the hip joint in this particular case. So up here you'll see I've written down how does it really influence the spine. So the first thing that we're going to see is that it creates some lateral flexion at the spine, meaning side bending. Side bending. So your major hip flexor is involved in side flexion or side bending of the lumbar spine, which goes from here to here. So if it contracts and it pulls the spine this way, part of the stretch means that we should be bending the spine the opposite way. If we go back to our reference here, it also does contralateral rotation. What that means is that as that muscle flexes, it contralateral means opposite, so it does opposite rotation, contralateral rotation. The third thing it's going to do at the lumbar spine is extension. So as the muscle contracts, when that muscle contracts, it pulls the lumbar spine into extension. So when we do a stretch, we want to actually try to put the lumbar spine maybe in some flexion, which is why this stretch is not a good hip flexor stretch, particularly for the psoas, which is probably the most significantly chronically tight hip flexor, because you're putting the spine in lumbar extension. We actually want to put the spine in lumbar flexion. I'll get to that in a moment. Let's head back to this. So how does it affect the leg? Well, we know it's going to pull the femur forward and do flexion of the hip. So it looks like this. That's why it's called a hip flexor. It's one of its primary functions. It also does external rotation of the thigh. So as that muscle contracts, it'll pull the leg into external rotation. So guess what? When we stretch it, we're going to internally rotate the thigh. The third thing it does to the leg is something called abduction or abduction. What that means is that as it contracts, it pulls the leg outward. So we're going to make sure that the leg is tucked inward relative to the spine. Okay, so now that we know how it affects the body, to stretch it, we're going to undo what the muscle does. So here are the things I want you to do in order. And as you'll see above, I put some numbers up here so that when I say internally rotate the femur, which is number 1, that references what it does, which is external rotation. Just so you can see that what it does, we're going to undo. And I put it in a logical order here, not up here, because this is the actual stretch. This is the understanding of why. So half kneeling means you're going to get down on one knee. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. The first thing it says to do now is internally rotate the femur. Internally rotate the femur. So this is the femur. Now when you internally rotate the femur, you turn it inward, you're actually going to kick the foot outward. So the foot goes out. I'll face you so you can see it. Foot goes out, so it's outside of you, which turns the thigh in. The second thing that we're going to do is tuck the tail. So tucking the tail simply means you're flattening the low back. You're preventing extension. So when you tuck the tail, you flatten the low back. And what that does is it pulls up on the front side of the pelvis, and immediately you're going to feel a lot more stretch in the front of the hip. You don't need to chase a distorted position to get the stretch. You just need to find the right position. Third thing that we're going to do is prevent a hip sway. Because it's an AB or an abductor, an abduction, what that means is that it has a tendency to do this, where the femur goes outside of the midline. We want to keep the femur vertical, so I'm going to bring my foot closer to my knee so I'm on narrow railroad tracks rather than wide railroad tracks where you can see the angle of my thigh versus my spine. Fourth thing that we're going to do is side bend away. So now with my tail tucked, I'm going to start side bending away from the muscle that I'm working. The last thing I'm going to do is rotate toward the same side, which we'll call ipsilateral rotation. I'm going to use this arm as leverage, and I'm going to start to rotate towards the same side. With the tail tucked, now I've got a significant stretch throughout the entire hip flexor complex, not just that muscle. However, we're really focusing on that muscle to get a great stretch. So that is a good baseline hip flexor stretch. It doesn't have to take long once you get the hang of it. I know that that sounded like a lot, but here's what it looks like. Hop down on a knee, kick the foot out, tuck the tail under, side bend away, and rotate. And we hold that stretch like we would any static stretch, maybe 30 to 45 seconds. Then we'll switch sides and do the other side. So this is what we're going to call step 1 of our hip flexor stretch. You're going to see in an upcoming video step 2, video 2. And in that video, I'm going to introduce the fascial system, which is going to have an even more significant influence on the hip flexion mechanism. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions about it, please reach out to us on Facebook at Real Active Wellness. Have a great day.